welcome to another edition of the Nets Insider Podcast, Episode 2. As we speak right now, the Nets are up 1-0 in the 2021 NBA playoffs against the Boston Celtics. Joining me, as always, my good friend, my compadre. He is the author of the history of the Brooklyn Nets, or actually the author of from the Nets from Long Island to Brooklyn with every stop in between. The one and only from the Nets Insider, Rick Laughlin. Rick, good afternoon, buddy.
Good afternoon, Randy. I got to give a tip of the cap. If that intro, as a Net fan, doesn't want to make you run through a wall, I don't know what does, because that intro that you put together there, Randy, is just top-notch quality. But I expect nothing but that.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Now the pressure's on. And speaking of pressure, Game 1 the other night against the Boston Celtics, it looked a little, I guess James Harden said it best. The crowd threw them off. They weren't used to it, and they took Boston's best punch in the beginning of the game. And the third and fourth quarter, the Nets came out and did things that I guess the Nets can only do.
And even you talk about the Nets as a franchise being starved of a championship, but even the borough of Brooklyn, since the Dodgers left in, 1957, they have not, before the Nets moved there in 2012, had a professional team to call Brooklyn home. And certainly since that point, going on now, 60-plus years, have seen a Brooklyn-born and Brooklyn-stationed team win a title. So with the Nets being at the forefront of the championship conversation, I think there was a little bit of nerves, and even for this big three, in the case of Kyrie and Kevin, they have climbed to and been on the top of the mountaintop. But there's something to be said, and Kyrie was LeBron's teammate, about winning a championship for your hometown team, which Cleveland is obviously, being born in Akron, Ohio. LeBron was able to deliver that first championship, and I think that really was the inspiration for Kyrie Irving. Really spearheaded this free agency period, which was last year, of signing with the Nets and bringing along with him Kevin Durant, because let's face it, he had to have seen how LeBron's championship and actually delivering that changed the complexion and changed the landscape of how the Cleveland Cavaliers are thought of in the NBA. And I think that Kyrie Irving wants this Nets championship pursuit to be part of his basketball story. So again, if there were some early Game 1 jitters, especially in that first half, it's understandable, because there is a lot of weight on this big three's shoulders to actually deliver a title to Brooklyn.
Yeah, and I think the one thing, too, we all have to remember, this is not the Nets' first dance with expectations. It's funny, we were discussing a couple different things, talking about Jason Kidd with the Nets franchise. The 01-02 season was enormously successful, with a championship loss to the Lakers, on a disappointing 02-03 season with a loss to the Spurs in the finals. Now the Nets aim this year with a big, I guess with Blake Griffin, you have to call it the Big Four. You have the Big Four with Blake Griffin, Kevin Durant, James Harden, and Kyrie Irving. Man, the pressure is on. Whereas when Jason Kidd was there with the Nets, everything was gravy. And so now that everybody gets up to play you, and let's be realistic about what the Boston Celtics are. They're still a young team with a young coach. Even though they've been here for a little while now with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown and Marcus Smart and Kemba Walker, nobody's expecting too much out of Boston. They might get a game. But you look at that second-round series against Milwaukee and a possible conference finals against the Philadelphia 76ers. There's no easy path here for the Nets.
Yeah, absolutely not. I think the Nets have their hands full. Tonight is going to be the kind of game, and I don't expect the series to go 6 or 7. If the Nets are able to step on Boston's throat tonight and make it basically they're going to have to sweep the Brooklyn back in Boston, they're going to put all the pressure in the world on the Celtics, which, is going to obviously bode well for a Nets team that is going to have its hands full with Milwaukee and potentially Philadelphia down the road. But one of the things you brought up, Randy, and I want to touch on this because you did mention Jason Kidd and we talked for the show, was looking back at today in NBA history as well as specifically Nets history. And Net fans are going to have a painful way of recalling this. But this today, which was May 25th, 2002, it seems like a lifetime ago, but in some regards seems like yesterday. The Nets blew that 25-point third quarter lead, a lead they had with inside of 1 minute in the third quarter that basically looked like in that fourth quarter the Nets were going to put in their bench, the Celtics were going to put in their bench, and both teams are going to rest their starters in preparation for Game 4. And what happened to the Nets was at the time the largest comeback in playoff history. You had Paul Pierce and Antoine Walker just living at the free throw line. I think the Nets won the penalty within 2 or 3 minutes into that fourth quarter. And that was a Nets team. You know, they faced elimination the first round against the Indiana Pacers. And in my book, Lawrence goes into it. A couple of the other interviews say that could have changed the whole trajectory of the franchise if the Nets get ousted in that early first round series against Reggie Miller and the Indiana Pacers. And certainly, if they don't pick themselves off the mat after going down 2-1 in Boston, and everybody forgets that Game 4, Paul Pierce missed the front end of 2 free throws, could have sent it to overtime. The fact that the Nets were able to rebound from such a catastrophic loss in that game, to me, still amazes me to this day because, as you mentioned, Randy, that year it was a Cinderella story for the Nets. No one expected them to be there. And the fact that a young team that was inexperienced outside of Jason Kidd was able to show that resiliency, I still sometimes pinch myself and shake my head at how they were able to get back into and win that series.
I'll tell you, Game 4 had some crazy moments, and I remember Jason Kidd celebrating at the end of Game 4, holding up the 2-2 sign to the Boston faithful. And, of course, we know Game 5, the Nets opened up a huge lead. Boston came back, and the Nets held them off at Game 5. Game 6, at the Boston Garden, Keith Van Horn hits a clutch shot in the final minute and a half to put the icing on the cake for the Nets to win their first Eastern Conference championship and eventually fall short to the Los Angeles Lakers. The following year, the Nets in the second round swept the Boston Celtics in a Game 4 overtime thriller. And at the Boston Garden or TD Arena. And I got to tell you, Kenny Martin, I have the picture still hanging up. Kenny Martin hanging from the rim. He had a game. He had a couple games in games 3 and 4 in Boston as the Nets were able to sweep the Celtics, which ended up being the end of the Antoine Walker era in Boston. So, it was a very interesting time for the Nets going into their second NBA Finals against the San Antonio Spurs. That's another topic for another time. We're still talking about the Nets and the Celtics. It was interesting that you brought up the history aspect of the Nets and Celtics for the playoffs today. Tonight, Game 2, Rick, we can sit here and break down stats. But I think the most important aspect of this game is going to be if the Big Four can put up the numbers that they're accustomed to making. The pressure ends up being on the Celtics if they can make stops and take advantage of the opportunities when they have them.
And just to go back to today in Nets history, looking back that 2002 Eastern Conference Finals, what we forget is in the 2003 Eastern Conference Finals, the Nets had already swept the Detroit Pistons out of the playoffs. They were at that point winners of 11 straight playoff games, right, going into Game 1 against San Antonio. So they were basically resting and resting easy, waiting for their opponent in the NBA Finals in this year in Nets history in 2002-2003. And then the following year, of course, the epic 7-game series against the Detroit Pistons. And a lot of people forget the Nets not only lost games 1 and 2, the Palace of Auburn Hills at the time, but we're just flat out embarrassed in those first 2 games. I think the Nets scored 57 points in Game 1, and Lawrence Frank had to go back to the drawing board. It was one of the rare times in NBA history that a team that's down 0-2 went ahead 3-2 and then lost Game 6 at home and then Game 7 on the road. So that whole 2-2-1-1-1, I should say, it didn't go in the Nets' favor. But for me, when you look at the history of teams that are down 0-2, whether it's in the playoffs, in the first round, the semifinal round, the conference finals, the NBA Finals, there have the Celtics, who have always been a storied franchise, have been in the middle of so many epic playoff battles with the Lakers and the 76ers in the Eastern Conference and Atlanta Hawks, and the list goes on and on and on. They have been have come back from 0-2 in two separate series. The first being actually fairly recently, 2017. They were down 2-0 to the Chicago Bulls, the Rajon Rondo, Dwayne Wade, Jimmy Butler Chicago Bulls that were a surprise team that year. And they came back and they won that series in 7 games. And they also, in the 1969 NBA Finals, they were down 2-0 and they beat the Lakers, I believe, again in 7 games. So, look, I'm not saying that anything like that is going to happen. I don't envision an unbelievable comeback that the Celtics are either going to pull off a 2002 Eastern Conference Game 3 scenario where they're going to come back in the second half, or they're going to pull a 2017 0-2 series comeback. The only point is all the numbers are in Brooklyn's favor. The talent is in their favor. The coaching advantage, to me, I'm interested to see what Brad Stevens is going to throw out there, because that first half, as much as you want to tip your cap to what the Celtics did defensively, it simply looked like shots weren't falling for the Nets. They were getting whatever the shots they wanted at will. And when they kind of imposed themselves in that second half, they got to the basket with regularity. They got to the free throw line. They knocked down open threes. So expect Brad Stevens, who, you put him in a handful of top echelon coaches in this league with the Nick Nurses and Greg Popovich's of the world. I think he's going to have a lot of wrinkles on the defensive side of the ball. But again, there's really no formula or, fail-safe way to stop 3 of the league's premier scorers. And I don't think anybody to this point has figured out how to do that.
Yeah, and let's talk about the job that Steve Nash has done with this team. It is hard managing, I guess, the egos of it, being able to really handle what Kyrie Irving is doing as his mind is not fully on basketball, what Kevin Durant is doing, knowing that he has sort of a limit with his health, and with James Harden coming off an injury as well. And then, of course, Blake Griffin is there to fill in the cracks where he can. Steve Nash has done a pretty good job with this team this year.
And he's never going to get the credit he deserves, just like Steve Kerr with the Splash Brothers and Draymond Green, and then eventually getting Kevin Durant. They're going to say you have an embarrassment of riches on your roster, and of course you should win the NBA title. So no matter what Steve Nash does, it's always going to be, basically pointing the finger at him instead of the thumb, as far as the fact that he should not lose any playoff games as far as the detractors are concerned. But I have been impressed. He's a team first guy. He comes from, the D'Antoni system. I thought was a fantastic thing, hiring Mike D'Antoni to implement and put his fingerprints all over the offense. I didn't necessarily want Mike D'Antoni coaching defense, and I still think there's room for improvement there. But I have been pleasantly surprised. I mean, the Nets let up 20 points in that third quarter and 20 points in the fourth quarter, so 40 points in that second half, which I thought was a superb defensive effort. And we know the offense is going to be there, that they can play one-on-one. They can get a bucket whenever they need it. It's going to be those stops down the stretch that are not going to be necessarily the difference in these early round games like against the Boston Celtics. It's going to be the difference down the road against the Milwaukee Bucks in the following round, if that's the matchup, which looks like it is at 2-0 in favor of Milwaukee, or this Philadelphia 76ers, or dare I say beyond that. It's going to be the defensive side of the ball. And I still have some questions as far as beyond Blake Griffin. He's a hustle guy. He takes charges. Look, he's only 6'8", 6'9". Is he going to be able to compete with a Giannis, a Joel Embiid, and Anthony Davis? That remains to be seen. But I think as far as handling the lineups, managing the egos, getting all these guys to play connected offensively, to at least be respectable on the defensive side of the ball, you have to tip your cap to Steve Nash. But I just think the nature of the beast is he's not going to get any credit. If something goes wrong, he'll get all the blame, though. You can bet on that.
Yes, coaches lose games, players win games. By the way, for those who are watching live right now, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook, thank you for making us part of your day today live right now. As you can see, I am live from my vehicle. Rick is live from his living room. Coming up still, we have Game 2 predictions. This portion of the program is brought to you by our good friends over at Level 1 Games, Fountain Plains, New Jersey. Check it out there. Check out M, Cynthia, and Tim. They'll be glad to take your game to the next level and relive your past, as they are a full service video game store, whether it's old video games, new video games, they card games, Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, they have it all. Go to Level 1 Games right now, Level 1 Games with the number 1 in the middle, level1games.com, or check them out at Level 1 Games in Pompton Plains, New Jersey, Route 23 South. Okay, so Rick, it is prediction time. What do you have for Game 2?
I think this is going to be more of the same. I think Brooklyn uncovered a lot of basically got past the nerve stage of the playoffs. They now got their feet wet. They've understood being in front of a 13,000 seat capacity arena, what the energy is going to be like in the arena. So I don't think that's going to become an early first half factor. Ultimately, for me, I think that this is going to be a game that it's going to be a coming out party for Kevin Durant. The big three already scored 82 points in that first game one. I expect more of the same, and that contest should not have even been that close had the bench played up to snuff. I think the major adjustment the Nets need to make is Time Lord, Robert Williams in the middle. I mean, he had 8 blocks to tie a Celtics playoff record. You couldn't get any shot off against him in the lane. I think he blocked Bruce Brown a couple of times. He certainly blocked Kyrie Irving. So I think the Nets are going to go with the small ball lineup, draw him out of the paint. Regardless of what defense Brad Stevens moves to, if the Nets are making shots, it's going to be a long night for the Celtics. If I'm going to make a prediction, I'm going to say it's going to be a higher scoring game. I could see the Nets going in the 125 range. So I'm going to say 125, 111 Nets, and I don't even think it will be, frankly, a close game in the fourth quarter.
Interesting prediction number there. The Nets are very prone right now to be putting points on the board. So I'll give my prediction in 1 second. I think right now, if you look at what the Nets have done this season with putting points on the board and everything else, defensively is going to be the key. I'm not saying for this series, because I feel right now Jason Tatum and Kemba Walker are their big two, obviously. And I felt like they had both of them pretty much under control in the first game. Tatum's going to get his points. I don't think there's any more questions about that. But I can't see them having the firepower to match it. So I'm going to see your 125, and I'm going to go 142 to.
You're going to ABA score.
Yeah, why not? Right?
Back to the ABA days, yeah.
Well, we don't know how to play defense in the NBA today. So this is my prediction. You ready?
Sure.
Boom. I'll put it right on the screen here for you. 142 to 123. Let's
wow.
Look, if we end up with a 98-74 score, I'll be very very surprised, but I think that's just the way it is. Hey, Rick, before we close up shop here, let's everybody know where they can find the Nets Insider.
So, again, you can go to netsinsider.com, spelled exactly like Nets, N-E-T-S, Insider. And on Twitter is @NetsInsider1, the number 1, or not W-O-N, but the number 1. And on Facebook @Nets Insider as well. So, again, Randy and I periodically are going to be recapping, reviewing, and hopefully previewing some more playoff games down the road. And be sure to tune in with us either live or re-listen to us, right, Randy? We're on Spotify and a number of different platforms.
Yes, we are on Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts. Of course, also you can find the show at backsportspage.com. I'd like to thank them for helping us out. And also, you can go to Facebook and Twitter, like Rick suggested, and, of course, anywhere where you have your podcasts available. Rick, I guess we'll find out after Game 2 if we were right or wrong, and we'll come back maybe either at the end of the week or beginning of the week and try and also have a guest to break down Game 2 and possibly Game 3.
And we might need to get somebody that's not a Net fan. Maybe it'll be a Celtic beat writer, or maybe, dare I say, a former Celtic player who can give us some of the Boston side of things. Because again, we're on the side of Goliath, and I'd like to hear from David.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right, Rick. So we will circle back. Enjoy Game 2 tonight, and we will be back next time here on the Nets Insider.